Welcome back. If you're joining us today, you are probably someone who wants to bypass the overwhelming noise of the daily information avalanche and just get straight to the aha moments. We really want to be your shortcut to keeping well informed. But today, our mission is actually a little bit meta. We're taking a deep dive into the very nature of how we know what we know.
Right, it's really the ultimate behind-the-scenes look at the human mind. We are essentially interrogating our own certainties.
Yeah, and our guide for this journey is this dense but deeply, deeply illuminating piece of source material called Architectures of Understanding. It's subtitled A Complete Guide to Epistemology. Now, I know that word epistemology might sound like something strictly reserved for, a dusty university lecture hall, but it is fundamentally relevant to every single decision you make today, from what you buy at the grocery store to who you vote for.
Exactly. At its core, epistemology is simply the philosophical study of knowledge. It's this massive tradition spanning over 2,000 years, starting all the way back with the ancient Greeks and extending right up into modern cognitive science and even artificial intelligence.
So, what are we actually diving into today? What's the map look like?
We're going to tackle the foundational mysteries of human awareness. We'll be exploring questions like, what is knowledge, fundamentally? How do we come to know things? What justifies our beliefs? And probably the most humbling question of all, are there hard limits to what humans can possibly know?
Okay, let's unpack this. Because I promise, by the time we finish this conversation, the way you view your own daily thoughts, the news feeds you scroll through, and the things you feel absolute certainty about, all of it is going to shift. But let's go back to the beginning. We need a working definition of knowledge.
Yeah.
And to get that, we have to look at Plato, right?
Yes, specifically in a dialogue he wrote called the Theaetetus. For roughly 2,000 years, Plato actually provided the gold standard for what constitutes knowledge.
Right.
He defined it as justified true belief.
Justified true belief. 3 words that seem super simple, but carry a lot of weight.
They do. Think of them as the 3 mandatory ingredients for knowledge. First, the belief has to be true. You obviously cannot know something that is completely false. Second, you as a person must actively believe it. It can't just be a random fact floating out there in a textbook. You have to hold it in your mind. And third, that belief must be justified. You need a good rational reason for believing it.
Okay, so if I just blindly guess that it's raining in a city halfway across the world and I happen to be right by pure chance, I don't possess quote-unquote knowledge of the weather there. I just made a lucky guess. I lacked the justification.
Precisely. You nailed it. And for millennia, that 3-cart formula justified true belief was the undisputed bedrock of epistemology. Everyone just accepted it.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, because jump forward to 1963, and a philosopher named Edmund Gidier dropped an absolute bombshell on this 2,000-year-old definition.
It's wild because it was a very short paper, just a few pages, but it completely disrupted the field overnight. Gidier demonstrated that you could actually have all 3 of Plato's ingredients you could possess, a justified true belief. But because of some bizarre fluke or coincidence, it still fails to feel like genuine knowledge.
And this is famously referred to as the Gidier problem.
Right. So imagine you're walking past a town clock. You look up, and the clock says it's exactly 2 o'clock. You form a belief that it is 2 o'clock. It's justified because you're looking at a public clock that is historically very reliable. And as it turns out, the actual time is exactly 2 o'clock.
So justified true belief, check, check, check. I know what time it is.
But here is the catch. The clock is actually broken. It stopped exactly 12 hours ago. You only believe it's 2 o'clock because you happen to look at a completely broken clock at the exact right millisecond. So do you really know what time it is?
Oh, wow.
Gidier argued that you don't. Your belief was true, and you had a solid reason for it. But the connection between the truth and your justification was just a massive coincidence.
Let me try to put that in a more modern context for you listening. Say I glance at a weather widget on my phone. It says it's 70 degrees outside. I believe it. My justification is that the widget is usually right, and it is in fact 70 degrees. But unbeknownst to me, my phone lost its internet connection 3 days ago, and the screen just froze on 70 degrees. I got totally lucky.
Exactly. That's a perfect Gidier case.
It feels like my illusion of knowledge just shattered right there. But if knowledge is that slippery to define, where does it even originate? Our source frames this origin story as this massive clash between 2 major philosophical squads.
Oh, it is a great debate of epistemology. On one side of the ring, you have empiricism.
Let's look at their playbook. You've got heavyweight thinkers like John Locke and David Hume, and their fundamental stance is that knowledge comes strictly from sensory experience. Everything we know because we've seen it, touched it, heard it, or tasted it.
They are the ultimate seeing is believing crowd. They argue that the mind starts as a completely blank slate, a tabula rasa, and our senses write the data onto it as we go through life.
But then coming in from the opposite corner, we have rationalism. This side features guys like René Descartes and Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. And their opposing view is that knowledge does not just come from our senses, mainly because our senses can frequently deceive us, right? Instead, knowledge comes from reason and from innate ideas already structured inside the mind.
Yes. To a rationalist, the most profound truths, things like mathematics or fundamental logic, aren't things you discover by touching a hot stove or smelling a flower. They are discovered through internal deduction and pure reason. You don't need to see a triangle to know its internal angles add up to 180 degrees.
It seems like a totally irreconcilable turf war. You have one side pointing aggressively at sensory evidence and the other side pointing at pure logic.
What's fascinating here is how the philosopher Immanuel Kant stepped in and essentially ended the war. He created this brilliant synthesis of the two opposing ideas.
Let me make sure I'm getting this. Is it kind of like baking? So empiricism brings the flour and sugar, the raw sensory ingredients. Rationalism is the recipe or the internal structure of how things go together. Kant is saying you cannot make a cake without both. Without the raw ingredients, you have nothing to bake. But without the recipe, you just have a chaotic pile of powder. Is that a fair way to look at it?
That is a wonderful analogy, actually. Kant argued that knowledge is essentially a mashup. It arises from both our sensory experiences and the internal structures of our minds working together simultaneously.
So he's validating both sides.
Exactly. He basically said that the empiricists are correct, that the raw material of knowledge comes from the senses, but the rationalists are also correct, because the mind is definitely not a blank slate. The mind actively organizes, filters, and structures that raw sensory data into something we can actually comprehend.
Kant brings the ingredients and the recipe together. I love that. But even if we understand where knowledge comes from, there's another really tricky problem presented in our materials. It goes like this. If you have a belief, you need a reason for it. But then you need a reason for that reason, and a reason for that reason.
The endless chain.
Right. I know this is often compared to a toddler endlessly asking why, but I want to push back on that for a second. Surely at some point, a fact is just a fact. Like if I say fire is hot, I don't need an infinite chain of philosophical reasons. I just know it burns because I can feel it.
Well, you have intuitively stumbled onto one of the primary solutions to what philosophers call the regress problem. Because if every single belief requires justification, you eventually fall into an infinite chain of justifications. It just goes down forever. But the solution you just described is called foundationalism.
Okay, tell me a bit more about that.
Foundationalism is the idea that the chain of whys does eventually hit bedrock. There are some basic beliefs that simply do not require any further justification. They're entirely self-evident, like your example of feeling the heat of a fire, or basic logical truths like I exist. They act as the solid foundation of house, and every other belief is built on top of them.
That makes perfect sense to me. The house needs a foundation. What are the other options, though?
The second lifeboat is called coherentism. This abandons the idea of a firm foundation entirely. Instead, coherentists argue that beliefs are justified by how well they lock together and cohere with all your other beliefs.
So less like a brick wall and more like a spider web. No single thread supports the whole thing, but together they create a really strong structure.
Yes, a web of interconnected beliefs.
If we apply that to the listener's life for a second, think about how incredibly hard it is to change someone's mind in a political or social debate. If they are operating as a coherentist, you aren't just attacking one isolated brick of their argument. You are pulling at a single thread that threatens to unravel their entire web of how they view the world. No wonder people get so utterly defensive.
That's a very astute observation, and it honestly explains a great deal of human psychology. It feels like an existential threat to the whole web. And just for the sake of completion, the third option to escape the regress problem is infinitism.
Which is what?
This one basically leans into the skid. Infinitists argue that justification genuinely is an infinite chain of reasons, and that is a perfectly acceptable state of affairs. We just never reach the bottom.
Yeah, I think my brain definitely prefers the spider web over the endless void. But this brings up a very practical issue for you, the listener. When you make a decision at work or in your personal life, how do you know your justification is actually valid?
Philosophers usually fall into one of two camps to solve this practical issue. Internalists argue that justification depends entirely on factors the thinker can actively access in their own mind. If you cannot mentally point to the specific reason why you believe something, you are not justified.
Basically, you have to be able to show your work, like in high school math test.
Yes, exactly. But externalists argue something quite different. They say justification can rely on processes that are completely outside of our conscious awareness. A really famous version of this is called reliabilism, which was proposed by the philosopher Alvin Goldman. Under reliabilism, a belief is justified if it's produced by a reliable cognitive process, even if you don't understand how that process works.
Let me see if I grasp this one. If I have great eyesight and my eyes suddenly tell me a car is swerving into my lane, my belief that I need to slam on the brakes is justified because human vision is a generally reliable process. I don't need to know anything about the optic nerve, visual cortex processing, or the physics of light to be justified in my belief. I just trust the bodily machinery.
Exactly. You are relying on an external, reliable process. You don't have to show your work.
But what if the machinery is lying to us? I want to ask a frankly terrifying question on behalf of everyone listening right now. What if we actually know absolutely nothing at all?
Ah, welcome to philosophical skepticism. This is the part of epistemology that questions whether genuine knowledge is even possible in the first place. The text highlights Pyrrho, an ancient Greek skeptic who claimed that certainty is flat out impossible. He argued that for every argument, there's an equal and opposite argument, so the only rational response is to suspend judgment on absolutely everything.
That is some serious ancient paranoia. But looking at our source, there are modern thought experiments that are even more unnerving. I'm looking at the brain in a vat scenario and these radical illusion scenarios.
Right, these are classic modern philosophical tools. The brain in a vat asks, how do you know you're a physical person sitting in a room right now, listening to a conversation, and not just a disembodied brain floating in a jar of nutrients hooked up to a supercomputer that is perfectly simulating this entire reality?
The terrifying part is that you cannot definitively prove you're not. All your sensory inputs, the feeling of the chair you're sitting on, the sound of our voices, they would feel perfectly identical in that simulation.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the goal of these thought experiments isn't to literally convince you that you are a brain in a jar. It's to demonstrate that our justifications for our most basic core beliefs are far more fragile than we care to admit.
So how does humanity fight back against that kind of crushing skepticism? Because if I spend my whole day wondering if my desk is a computer simulation, I'm never going to get any actual work done.
One major counterattack comes from Thomas Reid, who proposed common sense philosophy. Reid essentially argued that it is profoundly irrational to doubt our everyday beliefs about the world. He said that human beings are naturally endowed with faculties that yield truth, and doubting them just for the sake of a philosophical exercise goes against common sense.
He basically looked at the skeptics and said, come on, let's be reasonable here. I need to live my life.
He really did. Another really strong defense is contextualism. This is the idea that the standards for knowledge actually shift depending on the context you find yourself in. So, in a high-level philosophy classroom, the standard for knowing you have hands might be incredibly high. You have to somehow disprove the brain in a vat theory. But at the grocery store, the standard is much, much lower. You just need to know you have hands so you can grab a carton of milk.
That is incredibly practical. And that ties into a brief point our guide makes about how we perceive the external world in the first place. When I look at a coffee mug on my desk, am I seeing the mug or am I seeing something else?
That's the classic debate between direct realism and representationalism. Direct realism says, yes, we perceive objects directly as they exist in the physical world. Representationalism argues that we only ever perceive our own mind's mental representations of those objects.
Let me try to visualize that. Imagine your brain is locked in a dark movie theater. Your senses, your eyes, your ears, your fingertips are the projector. You never actually touch the actors on the screen, you just see the projection. Representationalism argues we are forever stuck in the theater, merely watching the film our senses are playing for us.
That is a perfect visualization of the concept. We never access the object itself, only the broadcast.
So what does this all mean? We've talked about ancient Greeks, brains and vats, and infinite chains of reasoning, but how does all this abstract philosophy translate to your daily reality?
It translates remarkably well when we transition into social epistemology. For a really long time, philosophers treated knowledge as a solo sport. One isolated thinker sitting by a fire trying to figure out the universe all by themselves. But social epistemology recognizes that knowledge is deeply communal.
Most of what we know, we only know because someone else told us.
Yes. Knowledge emerges from testimony, from scientific institutions, and through what are called social trust networks. You likely believe the Earth is round, but you haven't personally flown into orbit to verify the curvature. You trust the scientific institutions and the testimony of astronauts and physicists.
And this brings us right into the modern minefield. Our source material has a really substantial section on applied epistemology. This is taking these ancient frameworks and dropping them squarely into today's most pressing issues: misinformation, conspiracy theories, media reliability, and scientific authority.
It is incredibly relevant.
Right.
When you are scrolling through your phone looking at a news feed, you are actively engaging in applied epistemology every second.
Let's play out a scenario impartially to see how this works. Imagine two people reading the exact same highly sensationalized news headline. Person A immediately accepts it as fact. Person B immediately dismisses it as fake news. According to the text, they aren't just disagreeing on the facts, they are fundamentally clashing on the justification part of justified true belief. Person A's social trust network, the media ecosystem they rely on, tells them this source is a solid foundation. Person B's social trust network tells them it is completely unreliable.
That is the core issue dividing so many people today. If your social trust network is entirely different from your neighbors, then your foundational structures for what counts as reliable justification are completely incompatible. You are building your houses on two entirely different sets of bedrock. Modern epistemology is no longer just philosophers sitting in armchairs. It's actively teaming up with cognitive science, artificial intelligence, and the psychology of belief.
They're studying how human biases actively distort reasoning. We often think we're being completely logical, but our brains are just filtering information to fit our pre-existing spider web of beliefs.
And artificial intelligence is making this landscape even more complex. As we outsource more of our reasoning, fact-checking, and data analysis to algorithms, we have to ask a very difficult question. What does it mean to know something if a machine did all the cognitive heavy lifting for you?
That is a heavy thought. But fortunately, our guide offers a very refreshing, positive framework for navigating this chaos. It introduces a concept called virtue epistemology.
Yes, championed by philosophers like Ernest Sosa and Linda Zagzebski. What sets virtue epistemology apart is that it stops focusing so intensely on individual beliefs and whether a specific claim is perfectly justified. Instead, it focuses on the character of the knower.
It shifts the spotlight completely onto you, the listener.
It does. It asks a much deeper question. What kind of intellectual character traits do you possess? Do your habits of mind naturally lead you toward truth, or do they pull you toward falsehood?
Our materials highlight 3 key intellectual virtues that anyone can adopt today to become a better consumer of knowledge. The first is curiosity. This is a genuine, active desire to learn and understand, rather than just passively letting a social media algorithm spoon-feed you information.
The second virtue is intellectual humility. This is the willingness to look in the mirror and admit that you might be wrong, that your personal knowledge is actually limited, and that the justifications you've relied on in the past might be flawed.
And the third is open-mindedness. The ability to genuinely consider alternative perspectives without immediately getting defensive or retreating into your comfort zone. If you cultivate those 3 virtues, curiosity, intellectual humility, and open-mindedness, you are actively building a stronger, more resilient architecture for understanding the world. You literally become a better thinker.
This raises an important question, however. Even if you are the most virtuous, intellectually humble thinker in the world, what are the absolute limits of our understanding? Because even the most advanced epistemology recognizes that humans operate under hard constraints.
We simply cannot know everything.
We can't. First, there are the physical cognitive limitations of the human brain. We are biological creatures. There may be concepts, dimensions, or realities in the universe that are simply too complex for our specific neural wiring to ever grasp. We might be like a dog trying to understand calculus. Then there's the inherent uncertainty in our scientific models. Science is highly reliable and rigorous, but it is always subject to revision based on new data.
And then there's a concept that I find completely fascinating: the looming presence of unknown unknowns, the things we don't even know that we don't know. We don't even possess the vocabulary or the concepts to ask the right questions about them yet.
Ultimately, the pursuit of epistemology leads to a sobering but beautiful conclusion. Human knowledge may always remain incomplete and provisional.
And you know what? That is completely okay. It takes the pressure off all of us. Knowing that our grasp on truth will always be provisional means that learning isn't a final exam you have to pass. It's a lifelong journey. You don't have to have it all perfectly figured out today.
It leaves infinite room for discovery.
Exactly. Now, before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over on your own. It builds on that concept of social epistemology and trust networks we discussed earlier. If so much of our daily knowledge actually relies on social trust networks rather than direct personal experience, what happens to our personal sense of reality when we realize we've accidentally placed our trust in the wrong network? Take a hard look at your own beliefs today and ask yourself, how much of your knowledge is merely outsourced trust?
That is a brilliant and challenging question to carry with you into the world today.
Thank you for taking this deep dive with us. Keep questioning your certainties, practice those intellectual virtues, and stay curious until our next deep dive. Goodbye.